The Nile flows like a living memory, winding its way through time, carrying whispers of a civilization that shaped the very foundations of human history. Its waters, calm and eternal, conceal secrets that no historian's quill has fully captured, no scholar's parchment has revealed. Beneath the golden glow of twilight, the river shimmers like molten bronze, reflecting the silhouettes of ancient temples and half-buried monuments, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. Here, along its banks, lies a story that has been carefully hidden for centuries, a story of power, beauty, betrayal, and blood. It is the story of Cleopatra, not merely as the seductive queen of legend, but as the guardian of a secret lineage that the world was never meant to know. The image of Cleopatra that most people carry is romanticized, almost cinematic, a queen draped in silk, adorned with jewels, her intelligence eclipsed by tales of charm and seduction. Yet history, as we have been taught, is often a carefully constructed illusion. Ancient scrolls hint at far more than the love affairs with Caesar or Antony. They whisper of a bloodline so significant that even the mightiest powers of the ancient world feared its revelation. The true Cleopatra was not simply a ruler. She was a keeper of hidden knowledge, a custodian of secrets passed down through generations, a line that could alter everything we think we know about history. As the sun dips below the horizon, shadows creep across the sands, and the pyramids stand like sentinels guarding their untold stories. Scholars have argued for centuries over the location of Cleopatra's final resting place. Some claim her tomb lies beneath the ruins of Alexandria, swallowed by time, the waters of the Mediterranean having claimed it as their own. Others insist that the records were destroyed deliberately, erased from memory to protect a lineage that posed a threat to the powers that be. But what if these are not merely tales of speculation? What if a hidden truth waits, patiently, beneath layers of deception, waiting for the brave or the curious to uncover it? The air along the Nile carries the faint scent of papyrus and incense, a reminder of a civilization that once revered knowledge as sacred. Imagine walking through the streets of Alexandria as they were 2,000 years ago, hearing the languages of traders and scholars, witnessing the ceremonial processions in honor of gods long forgotten. Cleopatra moved through these streets not as a figure of mere royalty, but as someone intimately tied to the spiritual and political fabric of her age. Her life, meticulously chronicled and yet so conveniently obscured, suggests a deeper story. Every decision, every alliance, every rumored scandal might have been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to preserve a secret that the world was not ready to face. Legends speak of a bloodline that survived the fall of dynasties, the conquest of empires, and the relentless passage of time. It is a lineage that, according to whispers and hidden texts and fragments of forgotten manuscripts, carries more than noble blood. It carries a key to mysteries entwined with the very origins of power and civilization itself. This is not a story of mere survival. It is a story of deliberate concealment. Every era that has sought to rewrite history may have done so to erase traces of a line that could challenge the narratives we take for granted. Tonight, along the Nile, the river murmurs a secret. It beckons those who dare to listen carefully, to consider the possibility that the world has been looking in the wrong places, trusting in the fragments that survived when the truth was carefully hidden. Cleopatra's story is more than legend. It is a mystery woven into the very fabric of time, a puzzle whose pieces have been scattered across continents and centuries. And somewhere, waiting beneath layers of sand and shadow, lies the key to uncovering a bloodline that could redefine history itself. As the stars begin to pierce the night sky, glinting like tiny jewels over the vast desert, the river continues its eternal journey, indifferent to the ambitions of men, the rise and fall of kings, or the stories they would tell. Yet for those who seek, for those who dare to question, the whispers from the Nile are not silent. They are an invitation to uncover, to explore, and to confront a history that was never meant to be known. In this journey, we will traverse time, cross the borders of legend and documented fact, and follow a trail of mystery that leads straight to the heart of Cleopatra's most enduring secret, her hidden bloodline. Cleopatra's 7. The name alone conjures visions of power, elegance, and intrigue. She has become an icon, immortalized in art, literature, and cinema as the ultimate seductress, the queen whose beauty and intelligence bent the course of empires. Yet, beneath the glittering legend lies a far more complex figure, a ruler of extraordinary cunning, political foresight, and ambition. To understand her, we must step beyond the romanticized portrayals and peer into the fragmented historical records, where contradictions, omissions, and deliberate distortions raise more questions than answers. Cleopatra ascended the throne of Egypt in 51 BCE, a young queen in a kingdom caught between the clashing titans of Rome and the fading glory of the pharaohs. Her reign was not merely ceremonial. She governed with shrewd intelligence, navigating the treacherous currents of dynastic politics and foreign power. Ancient sources paint her as a woman who spoke multiple languages, who could charm allies and disarm enemies alike, not solely with beauty, but with her extraordinary intellect and strategic acumen. Yet even as these accounts survive, they are filtered through the eyes of her Roman adversaries, who had reasons to diminish her achievements, framing her as a temptress rather than a sovereign. Much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from writers such as Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius. These historians offer glimpses into her life, but their works are rife with bias and political agenda. They emphasize her romantic entanglements with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, highlighting scandal over statecraft. But the very focus on romance may be a deliberate distraction, a way to obscure her true influence and the significance of her lineage. What were they trying to hide? Perhaps the most striking mystery lies not in her love affairs, but in what they chose not to record, evidence of a bloodline that could shift the understanding of power in the ancient world. Cleopatra's alliances were calculated, her relationships intertwined with strategy as much as desire. Her union with Julius Caesar solidified her hold on the throne and intertwined her dynasty with the most powerful man in Rome. After Caesar's assassination, her alliance with Mark Antony was equally strategic, seeking to preserve Egypt's independence and secure her family's legacy. Historians recount the lavish banquets, the political intrigue, and the military campaigns that defined her reign, yet subtle details in these accounts suggest deeper layers of secrecy. The question lingers: could Cleopatra's true legacy lie not in the alliances she forged publicly, but in the lineage she nurtured in secret? The queen's death in 30 BCE is among history's most enduring mysteries. Ancient sources claim she committed suicide, famously by the bite of an asp, to avoid humiliation by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. But even this story is shrouded in uncertainty. Some scholars suggest that her death may have been orchestrated, that the narrative was tailored to serve Rome's agenda, to erase her sovereignty and erase the potential threat of her descendants. If Cleopatra's bloodline had continued, deliberately hidden from the eyes of the conquerors, it could explain the deliberate gaps, the missing records, and the tantalizing hints that linger in obscure manuscripts. Cleopatra was not only a political operator, but also a symbol of Egypt's enduring power. Her knowledge of religion, astronomy, and Egyptian mysticism position her as a figure of spiritual as well as political authority. She claimed descent from the goddess Isis, aligning herself with the divine, a connection that carried both legitimacy and an air of mystery. In this duality, political and spiritual, public and secret, Cleopatra becomes more than a historical figure. She is an enigma whose true influence may have been deliberately concealed. Even the children of Cleopatra present a puzzle. Caesar Ion, her son with Julius Caesar, was officially killed on Octavian's orders, erasing a direct heir. Her children with Mark Antony, however, vanished into obscurity, their fates only partially documented. Could some have survived, hidden by loyalists or secret factions to protect the continuation of her bloodline? Scholars have long debated the possibility, but most conventional history brushes aside these questions as conjecture, ignoring the subtle patterns that hint at deliberate concealment. To understand Cleopatra fully, one must consider the interplay of narrative and power. History is often written by the victors, and in her case, Rome controlled the narrative. By framing her story through lenses of romance, decadence, and intrigue, the chroniclers ensured that the true scope of her political genius and the potential significance of her lineage would remain in the shadows. Yet fragments remain, whispered references, coded symbols, and the occasional surviving scroll, all hinting a story far richer than the one taught in textbooks. In exploring Cleopatra's life, it becomes clear that she was more than a queen who captivated men and courts. She was a master strategist, a guardian of secrets, and potentially the origin point of a lineage powerful enough to warrant concealment. Every public act, every alliance, every choice recorded in history could have been part of a larger, hidden narrative, one that stretched far beyond her death, one that may still ripple through time in ways we have yet to understand. As we move deeper into this investigation, the figure of Cleopatra evolves. No longer merely a historical icon or a romantic legend, she emerges as a central figure in a mystery that spans centuries. Her life, her reign, and the secrets she may have guarded all hint at a truth deliberately veiled from the world. And it is this truth, the hidden bloodline, the forbidden legacy, that forms the core of our journey. We are not just recounting history. We are following the faint, enigmatic trail of one of the world's greatest mysteries, step by step, into the shadows of time. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which Cleopatra inherited, was no ordinary royal lineage. Born from the conquest of Alexander the Great and forged in the crucible of both Greek and Egyptian traditions, this dynasty was a tapestry of ambition, cunning, and calculated marriages. It was a family where loyalty and bloodlines were tools of power, and secrecy was as essential as gold in the treasuries of Alexandria. To truly understand Cleopatra, one must first unravel the enigma of her ancestry, a lineage as intricate and shadowed as the hidden chambers beneath her capital. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, a Greek-speaking dynasty at the heart of an ancient civilization that spoke its own sacred language. They adopted the customs and titles of the pharaohs, blending foreign governance with local traditions in a delicate balance. Every ruler in this line was acutely aware that legitimacy rested not merely on conquest, but on the perception of divine and royal continuity. Marriages within the family were not just strategic. They were designed to preserve the purity of the bloodline, ensuring that each generation carried both political legitimacy and, perhaps, a hidden spiritual authority. Cleopatra was heir to this intricate web of ancestry, a living bridge between the classical world and the enduring mysteries of Egypt. Yet the Ptolemies were also a family riddled with intrigue, betrayal, and internal conflict. Sibling rivalries often turned lethal, and power frequently passed through assassination or exile. Cleopatra herself survived the machinations of her siblings, navigating political storms with a combination of intelligence, charisma, and, as some suggest, an almost preternatural sense of timing. The history of her family hints at a willingness to hide inconvenient truths, to erase rivals quietly, and to protect certain secrets at all costs. Could it be that the very bloodline she represented contained knowledge or claims that powerful players wanted to keep hidden from the world? The Ptolemaic obsession with ancestry may also have extended beyond mere political survival. Some historians suggest that certain lineages were believed to carry special significance, an almost mystical inheritance. Cleopatra's own reputed descent from both Macedonian Greek kings and the ancient pharaohs may have elevated her bloodline beyond ordinary nobility, giving it a perceived spiritual or cosmic importance. It is in these layers of ancestry that the first hints of a hidden legacy begin to appear, a legacy that could have made her offspring not only rulers, but bearers of a secret entrusted to few. The Ptolemies were meticulous record keepers, yet ironically, much of their most sensitive history seems to have disappeared. Papyrus scrolls, temple inscriptions, and genealogical record from this era are often fragmentary or deliberately obscured. Historians have noted inconsistencies in birth records, unexplained gaps in lineages, and references that seem to vanish without explanation. Such anomalies may not be mere coincidence. They may point to the deliberate concealment of information, lines of descent hidden from official accounts, perhaps to protect a bloodline that carried implications far beyond Egypt's borders. Cleopatra herself was acutely aware of the power embedded in her ancestry. She presented herself as the reincarnation of Isis, aligning her personal authority with divine symbolism. But it is possible that this symbolic connection also concealed a more practical reality. The Ptolemaic line, in her hands, was a vessel of continuity for something the world was not meant to see. Every marriage she arranged, every political alliance she formed, may have been designed not only to secure her throne, but to safeguard a secret, a puzzle encoded into the very structure of her family. The mysterious patterns of Ptolemaic rule extend beyond Egypt. Some scholars have traced threads of their influence into Mediterranean politics, suggesting that marriages and alliances were carefully orchestrated to interlink dynasties across empires. If Cleopatra's bloodline carried special significance, it is conceivable that her descendants were quietly relocated, hidden, or integrated into other noble families to preserve their secrecy. These theories, while speculative, are supported by the unusual longevity of certain genealogical lines and the curious gaps in historical documentation that surround the later Ptolemies. Artifacts from this period also hint at layers of secrecy. Temple inscriptions, symbolic reliefs, and amulets often feature cryptic references to family members who are otherwise unrecorded in mainstream histories. These items suggest that the Ptolemies were not merely concerned with political legitimacy, but with protecting knowledge tied to their blood. Cleopatra, inheriting this intricate legacy, would have been uniquely positioned to continue the work of concealment. Could it be that within her lineage existed knowledge so powerful or potentially threatening that generations of rulers felt compelled to hide it from view? The Ptolemaic puzzle, then, is not just a story of dynasty and succession. It is a narrative of secrecy, of deliberate erasure, and of hidden potential. Cleopatra's life, her alliances, and the whispers surrounding her children all gain new significance when seen through this lens. Her ancestry was more than royal pedigree. It was a map of hidden influence, a network of potential heirs whose existence could challenge the official histories written by conquerors. To follow the trail of her bloodline is to step into a labyrinth of power, where every clue must be read carefully, and every omission may carry meaning. As we continue this journey, the shadows of the Ptolemaic dynasty stretch forward, touching not only Cleopatra's reign, but the mysteries that linger long after her death. Each fragment of history, each unexplained record, each artifact becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, pointing toward a hidden legacy that has survived centuries of suppression. Understanding the Ptolemies is essential to understanding Cleopatra. not simply as a queen, but as the steward of a secret whose consequences may resonate to this very day. Beneath the golden sands of Egypt lie secrets that have resisted time, conquest, and human curiosity. The deserts and riverbanks of the Nile hide more than the ruins of temples or the faded grandeur of once mighty palaces. They conceal tombs, chambers, and passages that may hold truths deliberately obscured from history. Among these lies the enduring mystery of Cleopatra's final resting place. For centuries, archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters have scoured Alexandria and the surrounding regions, yet no undisputed evidence has ever been found. Some whisper that her tomb was deliberately hidden, its location protected by a network of loyalists, secret codes, and perhaps even spiritual guardians. Others claim that it was destroyed, erased from memory, to prevent the world from discovering a lineage that could challenge centuries of established power. Alexandria, Cleopatra's capital, was a city of marvels, bustling harbors, towering libraries, and magnificent temples dedicated to gods both Egyptian and Greek. Yet much of it was lost to earthquakes, fires, and centuries of political upheaval. What remains above ground is only a fraction of what once existed, leaving tantalizing clues scattered among ruins and fragments. Ancient texts refer to hidden chambers, subterranean passages, and secret vaults within the royal palaces, spaces inaccessible to outsiders and often protected by elaborate traps or coded inscriptions. These records, though incomplete, suggest that some knowledge was meant to remain unseen, carefully shielded from prying eyes. The idea of a forbidden tomb is not merely speculation. In the early 20th century, explorers reported unusual findings in Alexandria and the surrounding deserts. Sealed doors with inscriptions that resisted translation, underground chambers partially filled with sand, and artifacts mysteriously removed before proper study could be completed. Many of these discoveries vanished from official records or were dismissed as misinterpretations, fueling rumors of deliberate suppression. It is possible that Cleopatra's final resting place, or at least key evidence of her descendants, remains hidden within these secret chambers, protected not only by physical barriers, but by centuries of enforced silence. Tales of hidden tombs are also entwined with a broader Egyptian tradition of secretive burial practices. Pharaohs and high priests often constructed labyrinthine complexes beneath their pyramids or temples, designed to protect sacred relics, spiritual texts, and the mummified remains of royalty from desecration. The Ptolemies, including Cleopatra, were known to honor these customs while adapting them to their own Hellenistic style. Temples, palaces, and mausoleums might have contained concealed rooms or crypts, accessible only to a select few. Could Cleopatra have commissioned a hidden tomb with the same purpose, safeguarding not just her body, but the legacy of her bloodline? Some ancient accounts hint at tombs whose locations were encoded within maps, inscriptions, or even symbolic artwork. Certain papyri, though damaged and fragmented, describe corridors lined with hieroglyphs that speak of guardianship and secrecy. Scholars have debated whether these references were metaphoric, allegorical warnings, or literal guides to hidden chambers. Yet when examined closely, patterns emerge. Repeated references to protective spells, encoded names, and unusual alignments with the stars and Nile landmarks. Such details suggest that Cleopatra, or those loyal to her, may have deliberately concealed her resting place to ensure that only those with knowledge of her lineage, or the wisdom to interpret the signs, could ever locate it. The mystery is compounded by the destruction of historical records. Libraries, archives, and temples were repeatedly sacked or burned during conquests, leaving gaps in the historical narrative. Alexandria's famed library, a repository of vast knowledge, was destroyed in stages, erasing countless manuscripts that might have held crucial information about Cleopatra and her family. Similarly, Roman records often omitted inconvenient truths, particularly those that could challenge their own version of history. The combination of lost documentation and deliberate obfuscation creates a near-perfect environment for a hidden tomb to remain undiscovered for millennia. Legends also speak of tombs protected by supernatural means. Some tales describe chambers guarded by curses or spirits, designed to deter thieves or intruders. While modern archaeology treats such stories skeptically, they reveal the seriousness with which the ancients approached secrecy. Cleopatra's tomb, if it exists, may not have been left to chance. It could have been deliberately protected through a combination of architecture, coded knowledge, and ritual, ensuring that only the worthy could uncover it. The fascination with hidden tombs continues today. Modern archaeologists employ advanced technology, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and 3D scanning to probe the sands beneath Alexandria, searching for anomalies that could indicate undiscovered structures. Yet even with these tools, discoveries remain elusive, as though the tomb itself were hiding from those who seek it. Some researchers argue that the search is not simply archaeological, but also symbolic. Each attempt to locate Cleopatra's resting place is a step into the shadowy history deliberately erased, a confrontation with a past that the world was not meant to remember. Stories of forbidden chambers extend beyond Alexandria. Legends from across Egypt hint at secondary tombs or secret caches of treasures and manuscripts associated with Cleopatra and her family. Hidden in remote temples, buried beneath desert dunes, or submerged beneath the shifting sands near the Nile Delta, these sites may hold clues to a bloodline that survives only in whispers. Travelers and antiquarians have recounted finding inscriptions that speak of hidden heirs and secrets entrusted to the faithful, phrases that echo the notion of a concealed legacy stretching across time. Ultimately, the mystery of Cleopatra's tomb is more than a search for a physical resting place. It is a search for truth. Every hidden chamber, every sealed doorway, and every missing record speaks to a story deliberately obscured. The story of a queen who may have protected a lineage powerful enough to threaten empires. The challenge lies not just in locating a tomb, but in piecing together a puzzle woven from fragments of history, rumor, and legend. A puzzle whose solution could rewrite the narrative of one of history's most iconic figures. As the sun sets over the Nile, the sands swallow the footprints of those who have searched before, leaving the river and desert to guard their secrets. Cleopatra's final resting place remains hidden, a phantom in history, a forbidden tomb waiting to reveal its treasures to those who can unravel its mysteries. And it is in these hidden chambers, in the shadows of the known world, that the journey to uncover her bloodline truly begins. Throughout history, there have always been those who operate in shadows, custodians of knowledge, guardians of secrets, keepers of legacies too powerful to be left exposed. Cleopatra's hidden bloodline, if it existed, would have been precisely the sort of secret these invisible networks sought to protect or suppress. From the ancient Mediterranean to modern Europe, secret societies have long claimed responsibility for safeguarding knowledge that could alter the balance of power, and the legend of Cleopatra's descendants is whispered in the corridors of these clandestine circles. The Freemasons, for instance, are often dismissed as merely a fraternal organization, yet their origins are intertwined with the preservation of esoteric knowledge, sacred geometry, and symbolic traditions that date back centuries, if not millennia. Some scholars suggest that Masonic rituals and symbolism carry subtle references to ancient dynasties, including the Ptolemies, whose mastery of secrecy and ritual mirrored the very principles these societies would later uphold. Could it be that fragments of Cleopatra's story, her lineage, her knowledge, her secrets, were entrusted to such groups to ensure they survived the tides of conquest and time? Similarly, The Rosicrucians, a mystical society that emerged in Europe during the early 17th century, claimed possession of arcane knowledge preserved across centuries. Their teachings emphasize the idea of hidden wisdom transmitted through select initiates, a concept that resonates uncannily with the notion of a concealed bloodline. Legends hint that they guarded genealogical records, artifacts, and manuscripts connected to ancient rulers, including Egyptian monarchs. It is conceivable that Cleopatra's descendants, if they survived, may have been placed under the protection of such societies, woven into webs of secrecy that span generations and continents. The Catholic Church, too, plays a shadowed role in this story. Historical records suggest that the Church, particularly in its early centuries, was highly invested in controlling the narrative of the past. Documents were selectively preserved, rewritten, or destroyed to reinforce doctrinal authority and political power. A bloodline with ties to Cleopatra could have been seen as a threat to both spiritual and temporal dominion, and any knowledge of its existence might have been deliberately obscured. The combination of political influence and secret-keeping power-positioned institutions, like the Church, as both suppressors and unintentional custodians of history, shaping what future generations would be allowed to see or not see. Beyond Europe, whispers of hidden bloodlines also permeate Middle Eastern and North African lore. Certain noble families claim descent from ancient Egyptian royalty, their genealogical records preserved privately, away from public scrutiny. Many of these claims are impossible to verify, yet the persistence of the stories, passed down through generations, suggests that someone, somewhere, believe in the importance of preserving Cleopatra's legacy. Could these families be the silent heirs of a queen whose life and lineage were deliberately erased from mainstream history? Artifacts and symbolic relics also point toward the existence of custodians. Rings, amulets, manuscripts, and sculptures often bear subtle codes, signs recognizable only to those initiated into secret knowledge. Some historians argue that these items were scattered deliberately, forming a network of clues that could, in theory, lead a determined seeker to the truth. The challenge, of course, lies in the interpretation. The symbolism is obscure, layered, and deliberately misleading to all but the most informed observers. In this sense, secret societies acted as both gatekeepers and protectors, ensuring that certain truths were neither lost entirely nor freely available to the uninitiated. The idea of protecting Cleopatra's bloodline is not merely theoretical. Consider the political stakes involved. An unbroken lineage could represent legitimacy, power, or even a claim to mystical authority. For centuries, rulers have suppressed rival claims to thrones and influence. A hidden bloodline, carrying the weight of both divine association and political potential, would have been a threat that empires could not tolerate. Secret societies may have served as a shield, a way to hide potential heirs in plain sight, while preserving their knowledge and safety across generations. Some researchers speculate that these custodians have even guided European history from behind the scenes. Nobility, royal marriages, and political alliances may not have been random, but orchestrated to protect or obscure the survival of certain bloodlines. Cryptic inscriptions, coded manuscripts, and clandestine records suggest a pattern of concealment, one in which Cleopatra's lineage could be carefully preserved under layers of secrecy, myth, and legend. In this sense, secret societies acted as both archivists and protectors, ensuring that the knowledge of her bloodline survived even as the physical evidence of tombs, palaces, and records faded into dust. Stories of initiation, oaths, and forbidden knowledge are central to these societies. Members often speak of preserving what the world is not yet ready to know, maintaining legacies that could disrupt the established order if revealed prematurely. Cleopatra's bloodline fits this model perfectly, a secret so profound that it could reshape our understanding of history, influence modern interpretations of power, or even alter genealogical narratives that stretch across continents. The very act of guarding it, of hiding it behind layers of allegory, ritual, and secrecy, transforms history itself into a puzzle designed for the patient and discerning. As we trace the threads of these societies, a pattern begins to emerge. Cleopatra's descendants, if they existed, may not have been lost. They may have been deliberately placed under the watch of custodians, traveling through time hidden in plain sight, their presence recorded only in cryptic references, symbolic art, or oral traditions kept from public knowledge. Every secret society, every coded manuscript, and every whispered legend could be a piece of the intricate puzzle, a puzzle designed to protect a bloodline whose significance transcends mere royalty. In exploring the custodians of history, we begin to see a new dimension of Cleopatra's legacy. Her influence may not have ended with her death on the banks of the Nile. It may have continued silently, protected by invisible networks whose sole purpose was to safeguard knowledge too dangerous or too powerful for the world to know. And it is in following these threads, connecting the cryptic dots across centuries, that the journey into the hidden bloodline truly deepens, inviting us to question everything we thought we knew about history, lineage, and the forces that have shaped both. In the shadowy world of hidden history, artifacts serve as silent witnesses to truths too dangerous or precious to be openly recorded. They are more than mere objects. They are carriers of memory, cryptic symbols, and, in some cases, keys to secrets that empires have tried to erase. When it comes to Cleopatra, the artifacts connected to her life and legacy may hold clues not only about her reign, but about a hidden bloodline that has been carefully preserved or deliberately obscured across millennia. These relics, scattered across temples, tombs, and private collections, form a trail that, if deciphered, could illuminate a history the world was never meant to know. Among the most compelling artifacts are the so-called Cleopatra rings, jeweled bands said to have belonged to the queen herself or to her immediate family. Though few survive today, descriptions in ancient texts suggest they were more than decorative. They contain symbolic inscriptions, coded marks, and possibly even genealogical references. Some scholars speculate that these rings were deliberately designed to convey information about the Ptolemaic bloodline, using symbols that only initiates or loyal custodians could interpret. These rings may have functioned as tangible keys, connecting those who understood the code to hidden knowledge or secret locations. Scarabs, another common artifact, carry a more subtle but equally significant potential for secrecy. These carved amulets, often buried with the dead or worn as talismans, were believed in Egyptian tradition to protect the wearer and to preserve their essence into the afterlife. Certain scarabs attributed to Cleopatra and her court bear inscriptions that do not correspond to conventional religious texts, instead featuring cryptic sequences of hieroglyphs and numerical patterns. Could these patterns encode genealogical information or reference hidden chambers designed to protect the queen's descendants? Some historians argue that the repetition of specific motifs across artifacts suggests an intentional system of secret communication, a symbolic breadcrumb trail left by the Ptolemies. Papyrus scrolls offer yet another layer of intrigue. While the Great Library of Alexandria was largely destroyed, fragments of text survive, often in unexpected locations, hinting at knowledge that ancient powers sought to protect. Some of these fragments reference unnamed heirs, describe rituals with coded instructions, or speak in enigmatic language that scholars have struggled to interpret. The text's ambiguity may have been deliberate, serving as both protection and instruction. Those uninitiated would dismiss them as nonsense, while those with knowledge could extract vital information about lineage, burial sites, or sacred relics. Even architectural elements can function as artifacts. Certain temples, Palaces and tombs constructed during the Ptolemaic period feature hidden compartments, false doors, and symbolic alignments with the stars or the Nile. These structural anomalies may have been designed to safeguard specific relics or manuscripts tied to the royal bloodline. Some modern archaeologists have noted that key buildings in Alexandria and beyond contain hidden spaces that have never been fully explored, suggesting that physical evidence of Cleopatra's legacy might still rest untouched beneath the sands. Paintings, statues, and reliefs are equally enigmatic. Cleopatra is often depicted in art with attributes that differ subtly from other rulers of the time. Specific gestures, animal symbols, or patterns in her jewelry that recur with precise repetition. Scholars have debated whether these were purely decorative or if they carried hidden meanings. A closer examination reveals that these visual codes often align with historical events, genealogical hints, or astrological markers, creating a sophisticated system of silent communication. In essence, these artworks could function as keys to understanding both the queen herself and the mysteries surrounding her descendants. Even beyond Egypt, artifacts attributed to Cleopatra or her era have surfaced in Europe and the Middle East, often in private collections or secret archives. Gold jewelry, ceremonial tools, and manuscripts occasionally appear with provenance that suggest deliberate preservation by families or groups who understood their significance. These objects, carefully hidden and passed down through generations, may represent an unbroken chain of custodianship, physical evidence of the queen's enduring influence and the protection of her bloodline. Some of the most tantalizing clues, however, are those that seem almost deliberately misleading. Objects with inscriptions that appear nonsensical at first glance, tombs with entrances that lead nowhere, or manuscripts with incomplete genealogies all hint at a sophisticated system of misdirection. It is as if the Ptolemies, or those charged with protecting their secrets, understood that the truth could not simply be hidden. It had to be disguised, encoded, and layered beneath misleading information to survive the scrutiny of centuries. The idea that artifacts can function as keys is not purely symbolic. In some traditions, possession of certain objects was thought to confer authority or knowledge. A ring, a scarab, or a manuscript could serve as a token of legitimacy, proof that the holder had access to a hidden lineage or secret wisdom. For Cleopatra, whose political and spiritual power was intertwined, such artifacts may have been essential tools for protecting her heirs, ensuring that knowledge, status, and authority were safeguarded even in the aftermath of her death. The mystery deepens when we consider the modern implications. Many artifacts from the Ptolemaic era remain unexamined, hidden in private collections, museum archives, or forgotten storerooms. Technological advancements, such as spectral imaging and DNA analysis, offer the potential to unlock the secrets encoded in these objects, to decode inscriptions and patterns that may finally illuminate the queen's hidden bloodline. Each artifact is more than history. It is a cipher waiting to be solved, a key that could open doors to truths that have eluded humanity for millennia. In examining Cleopatra's artifacts, we are not merely studying relics of a bygone era. We are engaging with a deliberate, centuries-old system of preservation, one that hints at a hidden lineage, secret knowledge, and the careful orchestration of history itself. These objects, small and silent though they may be, carry the weight of a mystery that could reshape our understanding of the Queen, her family, and the legacy they were determined to protect. To follow them is to follow the echoes of a hidden past, a trail of tangible clues that may yet lead us to the ultimate revelation, the existence of a bloodline that history tried to erase. Long before Cleopatra's name became legendary, the lands along the Nile were steeped in visions, omens, and warnings, prophecies that spoke of dynasties rising and falling, of rulers whose legacies would reach far beyond their mortal lives. The Egyptians believed that the past, present, and future were intertwined, and that those who understood the hidden signs could glimpse the fate of kings and the secrets of bloodlines. Cleopatra, ever the master strategist, would have been acutely aware of this mystical landscape, where divine messages and coded warnings were as much a part of rulership as diplomacy or warfare. Among the most enigmatic sources are the so-called oracles and prophetic texts attributed to the priests of Thoth, the god of wisdom and knowledge. These writings, some fragmented and partially destroyed over the centuries, contain passages that appear to describe rulers whose influence would extend beyond the grave, whose descendants would carry power in secret. Scholars have long debated the interpretation of these texts. Are they metaphorical, designed to inspire, or do they encode literal warnings and instructions regarding bloodlines deemed too potent to reveal? The recurring theme is unmistakable, a sense that certain legacies were meant to be protected, veiled in secrecy, and entrusted to a select few. Cleopatra's connection to these prophecies is often overlooked in conventional history. Ancient accounts suggest that she claimed divine lineage, associating herself with the goddess Isis, a deity who symbolized fertility, power, and the preservation of life beyond death. But there are hints that this connection was more than ceremonial. It may have served as a protective framework for her descendants. By aligning herself with the divine, Cleopatra positioned her lineage within a sacred context, implying that her bloodline was not merely politically significant, but spiritually potent and therefore dangerous to those who might seek to erase it. Later texts and chronicles, written under Roman or Byzantine influence, often obscure these prophecies, dismissing them as superstition or allegory. Yet subtle references remain. Some manuscripts speak of a hidden seed, a lineage destined to survive the downfall of empires and to carry knowledge and influence in obscurity. Others describe symbols, cryptic inscriptions, encoded messages, and talismans that were meant to guide loyal followers to protect heirs or sacred treasures. These warnings, layered across generations, suggest that Cleopatra's bloodline may have been deliberately safeguarded, its existence veiled behind prophecy and symbol to shield it from those who would destroy it. Astrological alignments, too, played a critical role in these ancient warnings. Egyptian rulers meticulously observed the heavens, interpreting celestial movements as messages from the divine. Cleopatra was no exception. She was known to be learned in astronomy and astrology, often consulting the stars to inform decisions of state and personal strategy. Certain events, such as the conjunction of Venus and Jupiter or the rising of particular stars over Alexandria, were interpreted as signs related to the survival and protection of specific bloodlines. Could these celestial markers have been a coded warning system, guiding loyal custodians in the protection of her descendants and their legacy? The cryptic nature of these prophecies also created layers of plausible deniability. To the uninitiated, they appeared as vague allegories or religious exhortations. To the informed, however, they carried actionable intelligence, locations, symbols, and rituals that preserved lineage, artifacts, and sacred knowledge. This duality ensured that only those with the wisdom to interpret the signs could act on them, preserving secrets from the prying eyes of conquerors, historians, and political rivals. In this sense, prophecy functioned as both protection and instruction, a mechanism through which Cleopatra and her loyalists could influence the future even after death. Whispers of prophecy also extended beyond Egypt. During the Byzantine period, and later through the medieval and Renaissance eras, texts and oral traditions circulated that hinted at hidden heirs and divine legacies. Some claimed that certain families, particularly in Europe and the Near East, were descended from Egyptian royalty, their survival foretold in obscure manuscripts and alchemical texts. These stories, often dismissed as legend, suggest that the notion of a secret bloodline was not only plausible but acknowledged, even if veiled in myth and allegory. Prophecies, by their very nature, carry tension. They are warnings that demand interpretation, instructions cloaked in ambiguity. Cleopatra's potential foresight, combined with the mystical practices of her time, implies a deliberate effort to encode her legacy into a framework that would outlast empires, disasters, and deliberate attempts to erase her story. Every artifact, every coded inscription, and every cryptic warning can be seen as part of a larger system, a lattice of secrecy designed to preserve knowledge, influence, and bloodline across the ages. Ultimately, these ancient warnings elevate Cleopatra's story beyond that of a mortal queen. They suggest a deliberate orchestration, a plan to protect what was most precious, the continuity of her lineage and the secrets it carried. The bloodline she may have safeguarded was intertwined with prophecy, ritual, and celestial guidance, creating a legacy hidden in plain sight, yet invisible to all but those who could decipher the signs. The journey to uncover it requires patience, insight, and the courage to question history as it has been handed down. As we follow the threads of prophecy and warning, we begin to see the subtle architecture of secrecy surrounding Cleopatra. The hints and symbols embedded in texts, artifacts, and celestial alignments point toward a future shaped not only by her rule, but by the careful protection of her descendants. It is a story that straddles the line between myth and reality, history and speculation, offering the tantalizing possibility that the queen's bloodline was never truly lost. It was always meant to survive, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those with the eyes to see. The fall of Cleopatra was not only the end of a dynasty. It was the culmination of calculated betrayal and the systematic silencing of a lineage that posed a threat to the expanding Roman Empire. To the Romans, Cleopatra represented more than a foreign queen. She was a symbol of resistance, a ruler whose intelligence and ambition challenged the authority of Rome itself. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not merely political maneuvers. They were strategic threats to the hegemony of Rome. And when she fell, Rome moved swiftly not just to conquer Egypt, but to erase any trace of her power, influence, and most importantly, her bloodline. After the death of Julius Caesar, Cleopatra's position was precarious, yet she maneuvered with calculated precision. Her alliance with Mark Antony secured her throne temporarily, but it also placed her in direct conflict with Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Ancient texts describe the political tension as a delicate dance of strategy and diplomacy, but behind the rhetoric of warfare lies a subtler story: the deliberate targeting of heirs and the suppression of any potential continuation of Cleopatra's line. The Romans were acutely aware that even a single surviving descendant could become a rallying point for rebellion, a living reminder of Egypt's former independence and the power of its queen. The fate of Cleopatra's children exemplifies this ruthlessness. Caesar Ion, her son by Julius Caesar, was executed on Octavian's orders, officially eliminated as a political threat. Yet the historical record is strikingly sparse regarding her children with Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra and Antony, survived and was married into the Mauritanian royal family, but the trails of her descendants quickly become obscure, lost in the haze of time and political manipulation. The deliberate gaps in the historical record raise uncomfortable questions. Were some descendants hidden, deliberately shielded from public knowledge, or perhaps even relocated under secret protection? The possibility hints at a carefully orchestrated erasure, designed to prevent the world from recognizing the continuity of Cleopatra's bloodline. Rome's strategy was methodical. Political suppression extended beyond the battlefield and assassination. It encompassed the manipulation of history itself. Records were rewritten, monuments repurposed, and narratives of Cleopatra's reign reframed to emphasize decadence, seduction, and failure rather than her strategic genius or the potential significance of her heirs. By controlling the narrative, Rome ensured that future generations would perceive Cleopatra as a tragic figure of legend, rather than a queen whose lineage carried political, spiritual, or even mystical weight. Every omission, every erasure, was a calculated act of silencing, designed to protect Rome's supremacy and eliminate the possibility of a bloodline that might challenge it. This oppression extended to Egypt itself. Temples and palaces that may have housed genealogical records, sacred artifacts, and cryptic inscriptions were either destroyed, hidden, or deliberately obscured. Archaeological evidence points to layers of concealment, sealed chambers, inaccessible passages, and artifacts that were removed, hidden, or intentionally miscatalogued. The silence surrounding these sites is deafening, suggesting that those in power understood the stakes. A surviving bloodline could threaten not only Rome's political dominance, but the authority of institutions that benefited from the erasure of Cleopatra's legacy. The political climate of Rome also fostered a culture of betrayal. Allies became enemies overnight. Marriages and alliances were forged only to be broken, and loyalty was a commodity often traded for survival. Cleopatra's court, a microcosm of this turbulence, reflected the danger of power concentrated in a lineage that outsiders might covet. In such an environment, hiding heirs, dispersing descendants, or integrating them into distant dynasties may have been not just precautionary, but essential for survival. The very act of protecting her bloodline could have required subterfuge, secrecy, and reliance on loyalists who understood the magnitude of the queen's legacy. Yet even in the face of suppression, hints of her lineage persisted. Oral traditions, obscure manuscripts, and cryptic inscriptions occasionally surfaced, suggesting that the heirs of Cleopatra and Antony were not entirely extinguished. Some families in North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East claim ancestral ties to the Ptolemaic dynasty, though proof is often elusive. These fragmented traces hint at the possibility that Rome's silencing was not absolute, that hidden threads of Cleopatra's bloodline survived, protected by secrecy, exile, or even clandestine societies. The interplay of betrayal and survival paints a portrait of a world in which power is inseparable from secrecy. Cleopatra's story, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a tale of personal tragedy and more a testament to the fragility and resilience of bloodlines under threat. Every executed heir, every erased record, every missing artifact speaks to the lengths to which empires will go to control history. Yet it also suggests that what is hidden, if carefully preserved, can endure across centuries, waiting for the right moment, or the right seeker, to uncover it. The silencing of Cleopatra's line is not merely an ancient tale. It is a narrative that resonates through the ages, influencing genealogies, power structures, and historical interpretation. To follow the story of her descendants is to confront the deliberate obfuscation of the past, to trace the faint traces left behind by a dynasty that Rome sought to erase. And it is in the spaces between recorded events, in the gaps of history, that the possibility emerges. Cleopatra's bloodline may not have ended with her death. It may have survived, hidden in plain sight, safeguarded by those who understood its significance and protected through layers of secrecy, myth, and cunning strategy. The idea that Cleopatra's tomb was never meant to be found is more than a dramatic flourish. It is a theory rooted in the queen's own understanding of politics, sacred tradition, and the dangerous world she inhabited in her final days. Cleopatra was no naive monarch swept aside by the tides of Rome. She was a strategist trained in the ancient priesthoods of Egypt and the intellectual salons of Alexandria. She understood symbolism, ritual secrecy, misdirection, and the power of controlling her story even in death. if she anticipated that Rome would attempt to erase her legacy, as they ultimately did, then creating a burial that baffled her conquerors may have been her final act of resistance. In the last days of her life, Cleopatra watched the world she built crumble. Octavian had taken Alexandria. Her loyalists were dead or scattered. Her children stood on the edge of an uncertain fate. In such a moment, she would have been acutely aware that her tomb would become a political battlefield. Rome needed to display her body to claim victory, to show the world that the last pharaoh had been subdued. But Cleopatra would have recognized that her burial place, if left obvious or accessible, would become a trophy. Worse, it could be desecrated. The Ptolemaic dynasty's history, her bloodline secrets, and the sacred rites connecting her lineage to older traditions could be destroyed forever. This is the foundation of what scholars call the Forbidden Tomb hypothesis, the idea that Cleopatra crafted a burial plan with multiple layers of deception, possibly involving priestesses of Isis, coded rituals, and decoy chambers designed to confuse both the enemies of her dynasty and future grave robbers. According to this narrative, the tomb Rome believed they found was never her true resting place. The queen who mastered political theater staged her death and burial with the same precision as she had staged alliances, ceremonies, and royal propaganda. One of the most intriguing elements of the theory is that Cleopatra may have designed a two-tier burial system. The outer tomb, the one known to the public, would serve as the symbolic resting place, the acceptable narrative for Rome to impose on the world. It could contain personal objects, offerings, or even a cenotaph. An empty sarcophagus meant to honor the dead, but not hold the body. This was a common practice in several ancient cultures. The real tomb, the sacred tomb, would be hidden elsewhere, known only to her most trusted inner circle of priests and loyalists. The secrecy surrounding the priesthood of Isis, combined with their deep devotion to Cleopatra, makes them the ideal custodians for such a covert operation. They alone possessed the spiritual authority and the practical knowledge to protect a burial site for millennia. Some accounts from late antiquity mention Alexandria's temples being sealed with chambers below chambers. Others reference underground corridors that extended toward the sea, designed to hide relics during times of war. These cryptic passages raise the possibility that Cleopatra deliberately chose a location embedded within sacred architecture, where only initiates could decipher the clues. Her fascination with the cult of Isis and her self-presentation as the goddess's living embodiment add further weight to the theory. In Egyptian tradition, the burial of a divine queen was not simply a matter of placing a body in a tomb. It was a ritual that safeguarded cosmic balance. If Cleopatra truly saw herself as the last guardian of a royal lineage tied to ancient priest-kings, then protecting her tomb would have been a spiritual necessity, not merely a political one. Even the descriptions of her death contain elements of confusion, contradiction, and ambiguity. Roman sources, eager to declare victory, depict a straightforward scene. Cleopatra died in her chamber. Octavian saw her body, and she was buried with Mark Antony. But these accounts come almost exclusively from Roman writers committed to reinforcing Octavian's authority. The closer one examines the details, the more inconsistencies appear. Octavian never publicly displayed her body. No surviving Roman account clearly states where she was buried, and there is no physical record, no sarcophagus, no tomb inscription, no monument confirming the location. It is remarkably convenient that the queen whose intelligence and political skill posed such a threat to Rome somehow left behind no traceable burial. The absence of evidence is itself suspicious. Another layer of the hypothesis suggests that her tomb may have been aligned with astronomical or symbolic markers. Cleopatra and her daughter Cleopatra Selene were known to use celestial iconography to encode political and spiritual messages. It is possible that the true tomb's location corresponds with star maps, sacred geometries, or ancient alignments connected to Isis, the star Sirius, or the lunar cycles that marked royal ascension rituals? If so, the tomb may be hidden in plain sight, within an architectural layout that becomes legible only when interpreted through ancient priestly knowledge. Even if someone were to stumble upon the chamber, the meaning would remain concealed unless they understood the ritual code. Some theorists extend this idea further and suggest that the tomb was part of a broader escape plan for her lineage. By hiding her burial, Cleopatra ensured that Rome could never fully claim victory. As long as her tomb remained undiscovered, her story retained an element of sovereignty, a final sanctuary untouched by imperial power. The secrecy protected not only her body, but the possibility that her bloodline continued somewhere beyond Rome's reach. Whether this was true or not, the very belief in such a possibility may have inspired generations of priestesses, rebels, and scholars to guard the secret. The Forbidden Tomb hypothesis offers an elegant explanation for why, after 2,000 years of searching, Cleopatra's resting place remains elusive. It suggests intention rather than coincidence, design rather than disappearance. It paints a picture of a queen who, even in her final hours, shaped the narrative of her life with determination and foresight. According to this view, the tomb is not merely missing. It is protected, concealed by ritual, geography, and silence. If the theory is correct, Cleopatra's true burial is more than a historical artifact. It is a message, a final declaration that her identity, her lineage, and her legacy belonged not to Rome, but to the sacred traditions she embodied. And perhaps, still buried beneath sand or stone, that message waits for the moment it is meant to be heard. From the earliest depictions of Egyptian royalty, the serpent has stood as a guardian of wisdom, rebirth, and hidden power. In Cleopatra's world, this symbolism was not decoration, it was identity. The serpent was the emblem of Isis, the goddess to whom Cleopatra bound her personal mythology. It was also the protector of pharaohs, coiled upon their crowns as a living force, ready to strike at threats both physical and spiritual. When exploring the deeper layers of Cleopatra's legacy, it becomes impossible to ignore the presence of the serpent, winding through myths, rituals, artifacts, and even the circumstances of her death. This serpent imagery has led many researchers to believe that clues about her true lineage and the location of her concealed tomb might be encoded through symbols rather than through stone inscriptions alone. The most iconic reference, of course, is the legend of the ASP, the serpent said to have delivered Cleopatra's death. The traditional story claims that a venomous snake was smuggled into her chamber and allowed to bite her arm, ending her life quietly, even regally. But scholars have long noted that this account is suspiciously convenient for Roman propaganda, which needed Cleopatra's death to appear self-inflicted rather than murdered. More intriguing than the literal truth of the ASP story is what it represents. In Egyptian tradition, the serpent bite was not a symbol of defeat. It was a symbol of divine transition. Isis herself was associated with serpents in magical spells and resurrection rituals. If Cleopatra intentionally adopted serpent imagery at her death, it may have been a final spiritual statement, a coded message linking her end to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, a ritual gesture meant to protect her legacy from Roman distortion. The serpent also appears prominently in the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake consuming its own tail. This emblem was central to Egyptian cosmology, representing the endless cycle of creation and destruction. The Ouroboros was later adopted by alchemists, Hermetic philosophers, and esoteric societies as a symbol of hidden knowledge. In Cleopatra's time, the Ouroboros was more than a symbol. It was a sign of sacred continuity. Many theorists believe that Cleopatra may have employed the Ouroboros motif within her tomb design, perhaps in hidden carvings or within an architectural layout only decipherable to initiates of specific priesthoods. It would be a fitting cipher for a queen whose narrative was meant to outlive her physical remains. Another layer of serpent symbolism lies within the rituals of the Isis priestesses. These women served as guardians of sacred texts and encoded spiritual teachings. Cleopatra was not merely a political supporter of the Isis cult. She was an initiate, deeply familiar with their secret rites. Some of these rites involve serpent dances, chants invoking protective serpent spirits, and ceremonies aligning the body with cosmic forces represented by intertwined serpents. If Cleopatra worked with these priestesses to design her burial, then it is likely that serpent motifs were embedded into the tomb's symbolic code, perhaps as directions to hidden chambers or as protective seals designed to ward off intruders. Even in Cleopatra's royal regalia, the serpent played a crucial role. The uraeus, the rearing cobra worn on the forehead of pharaohs, was more than a decorative crown piece. It was a living deity, Wadjet, whose presence signified legitimate rule. Cleopatra's use of the uraeus linked her to the ancient line of pharaohs stretching back thousands of years, reinforcing the idea that her bloodline predates the Ptolemies and connects to older dynasties. Some fringe historians suggest that her serpent crown may have been modeled after earlier designs reserved only for priest-kings, hinting that her lineage carried sacred responsibilities suppressed by Rome. If such claims hold even fragments of truth, they help explain why her tomb and bloodline might have been intentionally hidden. One of the most fascinating serpent-related theories involves the idea that Cleopatra encoded geographical information into temple art and astronomical symbols. In ancient Egypt, the paths of celestial bodies were often represented as serpentine lines, curving, twisting, undulating across the heavens. These curves were sometimes replicated in land maps, river patterns, and ceremonial diagrams. It is possible that Cleopatra's tomb location is hinted at through a similar code, perhaps a serpent-shaped alignment of monuments, or a pathway leading from one temple to another, forming a pattern recognizable only to someone who understands ancient star charts. Some researchers have noted that the Nile Delta itself forms serpent-like shapes during seasonal flooding, an idea that feeds speculation that Cleopatra's tomb lies along a bend of the river once associated with sacred geography. The serpent code becomes even more intriguing when one considers Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra's daughter. Selene's coins and royal symbols often featured crescent moons entwined with serpents or sun discs flanked by coiling shapes that resemble protective cobras. These designs appear nowhere in earlier Mauritanian art, leading some to believe that Selene intentionally preserved her mother's esoteric knowledge through coded symbolism. If Selene inherited not only Cleopatra's political legacy, but her spiritual teachings, then the serpent motifs in Mauritania may serve as distant echoes of the clues Cleopatra left in Egypt. Through this lens, the serpent becomes a transgenerational cipher, a silent message woven through time. Even modern archaeological findings seem to reinforce the importance of serpent symbolism. At Taposiris Magna, excavators have uncovered serpent-adorned amulets, serpent-painted walls, and mummies buried with cobra-shaped jewelry. While none of these discoveries directly confirm Cleopatra's presence, they do suggest that the site was a hub of Isis worship heavily centered around serpent iconography. If Cleopatra was buried in a place saturated with serpent symbolism, the choice would have been deliberate, a declaration of her identity as the living Isis and a final invocation of divine protection. The serpent code also connects to broader esoteric traditions. Hermetic writings, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and believed to have circulated in Cleopatra's Alexandria, emphasize the serpent as a symbol of hidden wisdom, transformation, and enlightenment. Later, secret societies, from Gnostic sects to medieval alchemists, adopted the serpent as a symbol of forbidden knowledge. This raises the possibility that Cleopatra's bloodline and teachings may have influenced traditions far beyond Egypt, preserved not by accident, but by design. When all these threads are woven together, a compelling picture emerges. The serpent in Cleopatra's story is not simply an animal or a mythic emblem. It is a map, a signature, a protective seal, and a clue. It represents her sovereignty, her spiritual authority, and perhaps even the encrypted coordinates to her hidden resting place. The serpent is the one symbol Rome could not erase, because it lived in the rituals of the priestesses, in the architecture of temples, in the artifacts buried beneath sand and sea, and in the lineage carried forward by her surviving descendants. The deeper one follows the path of the serpent. The more it winds toward a singular idea. Cleopatra did not merely die. She transitioned. She encoded herself into history through symbols designed to outsmart her conquerors. And somewhere, in the serpent's coils, the truth of her bloodline and her tomb may still be waiting to be uncovered. For centuries, Cleopatra has existed as both a historical figure and a mythic presence. But in recent years, a new layer of fascination has emerged. Whispers that traces of her bloodline may still echo in the genetic fabric of modern families scattered across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and even parts of the Middle East. These ideas are not presented as proven science. They belong to the realm of speculative history, fueled by gaps in the ancient record, unusual family legends, and curious genetic markers. Yet, their persistence reveals something important. Cleopatra's story refuses to remain confined to the past. It continues to ripple through time in ways both mysterious and compelling. The most straightforward element in this speculation begins with Cleopatra's surviving daughter, Cleopatra Selene. Historically, she is the only child of Cleopatra's 7 definitively known to have lived into adulthood. She married Juba II, became queen of Mauritania, and ruled a prosperous kingdom. Her children, although not thoroughly documented, are believed to have existed, perhaps 2, perhaps more. After her death, the Mauritanian dynasty continued for generations, merging with local Berber nobility and eventually dissolving into regional tribes and aristocracies. From this basic fact emerges the first and most grounded theory, that Cleopatra's bloodline did not end, but simply shifted westward, absorbed into the populations of Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, and surrounding regions. Some modern families from these areas preserve oral traditions claiming descent from an ancient North African royal line, one said to trace back to a foreign queen from the east. These stories are often vague, wrapped in metaphors and interwoven with mythology. Yet a few contain surprisingly specific details. References to a moon goddess queen, a woman associated with the star Sirius, or ancestral ties to a golden kingdom located near the old Mauritanian capital. Whether these are remnants of historical truth or the result of cultural storytelling is impossible to know. But the resonance is striking, especially given Cleopatra Selene's known use of lunar symbolism and her devotion to the same Isis cult that defined her mother's spiritual identity. Another fascinating thread involves certain genetic markers in populations stretching from Egypt to Tunisia. Some DNA studies have identified rare combinations of Macedonian Greek ancestry blended with deep North African lineages. None of these findings point directly to Cleopatra. They cannot, but they raise the possibility of ancient intermingling between Hellenistic elites and indigenous groups. Cleopatra herself was of Macedonian origin through the Ptolemies, but her maternal line may have been partly Egyptian, possibly connected to priestly families. If Cleopatra Selene inherited this blended heritage, then small fragments of that genetic mixture could, in theory, have spread quietly through communities descended from Mauritanian nobles. There are also families in the Levant and parts of Anatolia who claim noble descent tied to Roman-era exiles and displaced royal houses. Some of these claims, when traced backward through medieval manuscripts or local genealogical records, end abruptly in the early centuries of the Common Era, precisely the period when Cleopatra Selene's descendants would have been active. These gaps, these sudden disappearances into antiquity, have fueled speculation that branches of her lineage may have moved eastward, perhaps through marriage alliances or political migrations. As Rome absorbed Mauritania and reorganized its territories, surviving nobles could have been relocated or fled, carrying their bloodline with them. Yet the speculation reaches even further. Some researchers propose that certain aristocratic families of southern Spain and Portugal hold fragmented traditions of descent from a lost African queen. This idea emerges from Moorish chronicles and medieval Iberian legends, referencing royal unions between Berber dynasties and local noblewomen. Whether this queen was Cleopatra Selene, a later descendant, or a symbolic figure is impossible to determine, but the persistence of these stories has kept scholars curious. The possibility of Cleopatra's bloodline extending into Europe through the complex waves of migration, conquest, and cultural blending that shaped the Iberian Peninsula remains a tantalizing idea. Unlikely, but not entirely impossible. Beyond genealogical theories, there are more esoteric interpretations. Some secretive family archives in North Africa contain old manuscripts describing a moon lineage believed to descend from priestesses of Isis who escaped Roman persecution. These stories claim that the lineage continued in hiding, maintained through spiritual rites and intermarrying families chosen to preserve sacred knowledge. In these tales, Cleopatra and Cleopatra Selene appear as both historical figures and symbolic ancestors, embodiments of divine feminine power. It is difficult to judge whether these manuscripts reflect literal genealogy or are part of a mystical tradition that adopted Cleopatra as a spiritual matriarch. Either possibility reveals how deeply her legacy permeated cultural memory. There are also isolated cases where modern individuals, through genetic testing, discover unexpected mixes of Greek, Egyptian, Berber, and Levantine ancestry, clusters that evoke the multicultural world of Cleopatra's dynasty. These findings do not identify individuals as her descendants, but they highlight how fluid, intertwined, and ancient Mediterranean genetics truly are. The sea that once connected Cleopatra's Egypt to the wider world served as a conduit for trade, diplomacy, intermarriage, and migration. In such an environment, lineages spread easily, and over 2,000 years, even the descendants of royal families can become indistinguishable from the general population. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this entire topic is not the genetic evidence or the genealogical trees. It is the emotional reaction it produces. People want Cleopatra's legacy to have survived. They want to imagine that somewhere, in a bustling city or remote village, someone carries a faint echo of her lineage. It speaks to a universal fascination, the desire for continuity, for legendary histories to live on through real human beings. Whether scientifically plausible or not, the idea touches something profound in the collective imagination. This longing speaks to the power Cleopatra still holds. Her story continues to transcend time because she herself transcended the boundaries of her world. Diplomat, strategist, scholar, queen, priestess. If her bloodline survived, even faintly, it would mean that her legacy was not extinguished by Rome's triumph. It simply transformed, adapting, traveling, evolving. It would mean that history's attempt to silence her failed, and that her presence lingers not only in memory, but in living flesh. While no modern person can claim definitive descent from Cleopatra, the possibility that her genetic traces remain scattered throughout populations connected to Mauritania, Egypt, and the Mediterranean is not entirely outside the realm of imagination. After 2 millennia of migrations, intermarriages, and cultural blending, her lineage, if it survived at all, would be a whisper rather than a clear line. But whispers can carry far across history. In this sense, the question becomes less about biological certainty and more about symbolic survival. Cleopatra's bloodline, literal or metaphorical, persists in the stories people tell, the legends families pass down, and the fascination she continues to inspire. Her legacy may live not in a single dynasty, but in a million subtle echoes, woven through culture, memory, and the mysterious pathways of human ancestry. Throughout history, certain institutions have carried reputations for safeguarding secrets, sometimes for preservation, sometimes for control, and sometimes simply because the past is too dangerous or disruptive to be freely known. When exploring the deeper mysteries surrounding Cleopatra's bloodline, her lost tomb, and the suppressed fragments of her final years, three sources of speculation repeatedly appear: the Vatican's sealed archives, the cryptic traditions of Freemasonry, and the unnamed custodians of ancient Roman records. None of these connections can be proven in the strict historical sense, but their shadows loom large in discussions of hidden knowledge. What unites them is a culture of silence, an archive of absence where certain stories are locked away, withheld, or hinted at only through symbolism. The idea that the Vatican holds extensive documents concerning Cleopatra is not new. The Vatican's secret archives, recently rebranded under a less mystical name, contain miles of shelving with centuries of correspondence, imperial decrees, confiscated manuscripts, and diplomatic letters. Much of this material has never been publicly released. Historians believe that early Christian scribes collected information about Egyptian religious practices in order to refute or suppress pagan traditions. Cleopatra, who identified herself as the living Isis, would have been a figure of intense interest. If early church authorities sought to erase or reinterpret the influence of older goddess cults, any surviving papyri or scrolls associated with Cleopatra's rituals would have been prime candidates for sequestration. It is not impossible that letters between Roman officials mentioning Cleopatra's final days, her children, or her burial arrangements may lie deep within Vatican shelves, inaccessible to all but a select few. There are also whispers about early Christian chroniclers who wrote alternative accounts of Cleopatra's death. Fragments of these writings reference a queen whose passing was concealed from the uninitiated, or speak of a false grave prepared for the conquerors. These cryptic lines appear in scattered medieval manuscripts, but their original sources are unknown. Some believe they came from lost texts stored in church repositories. Others suspect they were fragments lifted from Roman records before being destroyed or hidden. Whether the Vatican holds such texts is impossible to verify. But the institution's long history of controlling access to ancient documents fuels the belief that the story of Cleopatra was shaped, filtered, or partially obscured by Christian custodians who sought to diminish the memory of pagan queens. Then there are the Freemasons, a society deeply intertwined with symbolism, ancient architecture, and esoteric allegory. Masonic legends often reference a mysterious feminine figure called the widow, an archetype representing hidden wisdom and a lineage preserved through secrecy. Some fringe researchers argue that this figure reflects Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra's Seven, who indeed became a literal widow after her husband Juba II died and was later replaced by Roman-appointed rulers. Her symbolic identity as the widowed queen of the East appears in obscure Masonic texts that speak of a royal bloodline forced into silence, protected by guardians who encoded its memory into rituals and symbols. More traditional historians dismiss these connections as later inventions, symbolic rather than historical. But the overlap between Egyptian motifs and Masonic iconography is undeniable. Obelisks, the all-seeing eye, the sun disk, the serpent, the ladder to heaven, the compass and square echoing temple architecture. Whether Freemasons consciously integrated elements of Cleopatra's legacy or simply drew from the same ancient Egyptian reservoir remains an open question. But some scholars who have studied Masonic ritual structures argue that certain ceremonies appear to reenact fragments of the Isis resurrection myth, a myth Cleopatra invoked to define her rule. The possibility that Masonic traditions preserve knowledge connected to Cleopatra's priestly rites, even if unintentionally, adds another layer to the mystery. The silence surrounding Roman archives is equally intriguing. In antiquity, the Romans kept meticulous records, letters, reports, military dispatches, census lists, and official statements. Much of this material was lost in fires, wars, and natural decay. Yet some collections survived into the medieval era before vanishing into private libraries, monastic vaults, or aristocratic collections. A few fragments survive today in unexpected places. A monastery in Germany containing Roman commentaries on African provinces, a neglected archive in Spain with letters referencing Mauritanian trade routes, a medieval Italian collection featuring Roman administrative notes about captured royal families. These scattered clues suggest that far more once existed. It is within this context that the idea of the archive of silence emerges. The belief that certain Roman documents concerning Cleopatra's children and their destinies were deliberately hidden. Octavian, later Augustus, had every political incentive to control the narrative. If Cleopatra's lineage survived openly, it would have challenged the legitimacy of his dynasty. There are accounts hinting that Augustus ordered sensitive documents sealed or destroyed. What remains unknown is whether copies survived elsewhere or were quietly taken by scholars, priests, or secretive groups interested in preserving suppressed histories. Some legends claim that particular Roman scrolls describing Cleopatra Selene's children were brought to Europe during the chaos following the empire's collapse. These scrolls, it is said, were carried by monks fleeing persecution, eventually becoming part of private collections owned by families who played significant roles in the early Masonic movement. While such stories remain unproven, they reflect a persistent belief that Cleopatra's legacy did not vanish. It was hidden. In addition to institutional secrecy, there is the enigmatic tradition of coded references within medieval art and architecture. Some European cathedrals and manuscripts contain subtle Egyptian motifs unusual for their time. A crescent moon entwined with a serpent, a stylized crown resembling the uraeus, or depictions of a regal woman accompanied by symbols associated with Isis. Scholars typically interpret these as aesthetic borrowings or allegorical devices. Others propose that they may reflect knowledge transmitted through underground networks. Knowledge of a queen whose story had been deliberately silenced. The most intriguing element in this web of secrecy is the idea that Cleopatra's lineage itself may have been guarded by certain institutions, not out of loyalty to her, but out of concern for the potential political repercussions of revealing such a lineage. A surviving bloodline tied to both the Ptolemies and the ancient Egyptian priesthoods would have carried immense symbolic weight. In medieval or early modern Europe, such ancestry could have been invoked to challenge ruling dynasties or religious authority. It is not inconceivable that institutions with vested interests in maintaining order would have chosen to suppress or conceal this knowledge. Yet, secrecy is not always malicious. In many cases, it is protective. If fragments of Cleopatra's story were preserved by esoteric groups, it may have been because they recognized the power of ancient knowledge, the ability of symbols and myths to reshape identities and spark movements. By guarding these fragments, they may have sought to ensure that the Queen's legacy survived in a form untouched by political distortion. This notion that multiple institutions, separated by time and geography, all contributed in different ways to the silent preservation or suppression of Cleopatra's truth, captures the heart of the mystery. It suggests that her story was never fully erased. Instead, it became part of a hidden dialogue across centuries, encoded, obscured, fragmented, but never forgotten. In this sense, the Archive of Silence is not a single place. It is a network of secrets scattered across locked libraries, private collections, ritual halls, and forgotten manuscripts. And within this web, Cleopatra remains present, as a shadow, a symbol, and perhaps a truth waiting to be revealed when the world is ready to hear it. A curious tension settles over the narrative as we step into one of the most unusual chapters of Cleopatra's hidden legacy. The secret languages, occult scripts, and esoteric ciphers that may have preserved the truth about her bloodline when physical artifacts could not. For centuries, researchers, mystics, and renegade historians have whispered about a coded record that runs parallel to the classical histories of Rome and Egypt. An underground, symbolic tradition meant to bypass imperial censorship and survive the erosion of time. These transmissions did not appear in the form of scrolls bearing obvious genealogies or royal decrees. Instead, they took shape through sigils, encrypted maps, mythical retellings, and ritual diagrams embedded in various esoteric traditions stretching from late antiquity to the medieval period. To understand the possibility of Cleopatra safeguarding her bloodline, one must enter this world of symbols, where a single glyph can encode a dynasty and a ritual can hide a message in plain sight. Among the earliest whispers of such encoding is the veiled Isis, allegory found in Hermetic writings that appeared around the 1st centuries AD. While mainstream historians argue these texts were philosophical inventions by Greek-speaking mystics, some esoteric researchers believe the Hermetic corpus conceals symbolic portrayals of real political secrets. In this interpretation, the veiled goddess, whose face is hidden from the profane, represents a royal woman whose identity had to remain obscured to protect her descendants. Cleopatra, often associated with Isis, becomes the natural candidate. She embodied the goddess in ritual, drew legitimacy from her, and consciously shaped her public image to reflect divine motherhood. If her child or children were fated to be hunted by Rome, encoding the bloodline into a mythic figure would ensure survival without explicit documentation. This idea sparked centuries of speculation that behind Isis's veil lay not just metaphysical truths, but the shielded history of a queen fighting for her lineage's survival. As Egyptian temples fell and Roman governance solidified, symbolic transmission evolved. Priests who once wrote in hieroglyphs adapted their knowledge to scripts less scrutinized by Roman officials. One such evolution was the cryptographic form of demotic and the later esoteric adaptation of Coptic magical texts. Recovered fragments of these manuscripts often contain genealogical lists of gods intertwined with human figures, something scholars typically dismiss as religious syncretism. Yet a small group of linguists point to anomalous names, hybrid Greek-Egyptian titles, and odd chronological placement, suggesting these god-human offspring may be encoded references to specific individuals. If Cleopatra intended to protect her living heirs, threading their identities beneath divine allegory would have been a clever form of camouflage. Rome would destroy political documents, but they would rarely touch religious or magical ones, especially texts seemingly concerned with myth rather than state affairs. In the medieval period, these encoded threads allegedly began weaving their way into the European esoteric traditions. Here we encountered the most controversial claim, that a line of Black Madonnas worshipped across France, Spain, and southern Italy represent a symbolic remembrance of a dark-haired, foreign-born royal lineage, possibly one tracing back to Cleopatra VII. Historians attribute these statues to local Christian cults. However, esoteric researchers note peculiar anomalies. Many of these figures are accompanied by inscriptions referencing Queen of Heaven, Lady of the Sea, or Mother of the Hidden Sun, titles suspiciously similar to Egyptian epithets of Isis. Some statues appear to carry motifs resembling ancient Egyptian iconography, reinterpreted through Christian aesthetics. Whether coincidence or intentional encoding, these similarities sparked medieval secret societies to adopt the Black Madonna as a symbol of a concealed royal bloodline making its way across Europe under the guise of religious devotion. This idea intensified during the rise of alchemy. Alchemists were notorious for hiding truths behind metaphor, turning simple statements into multi-layered puzzles. In alchemical manuscripts, the Red Queen and the lost child of the philosopher's bride appear repeatedly. Some modern interpreters suggest these are veiled references to Cleopatra and her lineage, reimagined through symbolic chemistry. The Red Queen, beautiful, powerful, dangerous, and persecuted, matches Cleopatra's historical portrayal. The lost child, mysterious, protected, transformative, could represent a surviving descendant whose existence reshaped dynastic histories in ways not openly recorded. Whether this interpretation holds historical merit or merely reflects symbolic coincidence, its presence in multiple manuscripts hints at a persistent underground narrative that refused to let Cleopatra's bloodline fade quietly into history. Secret societies of the medieval and Renaissance periods further amplified the mystery. A few fringe historians argue that the Priory of Chaon, certain Templar splinter groups, and later Rosicrucian orders may have adopted syncretic symbols related to Isis and the Black Madonnas, not simply as esoteric expressions, but as markers of an ancient genealogical secret. Within these groups, the myth of a hidden royal child appears, though always cloaked in metaphor. Some texts describe a lineage born of a union between the Serpent Queen of the East and the Eagle King of the West, imagery that could echo Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Though speculative, the persistence of these motifs across centuries suggests that even if a true bloodline did not survive, the idea of one did, and ideas have their own power. They shape symbols, rituals, and mythologies across eras. One of the most fascinating symbolic threads appears in Renaissance occult maps. Several enigmatic cartographers embedded Egyptian symbols into their charts of Europe, particularly in regions associated with ancient migrations. A few maps even show isolated glyphs resembling the hieroglyph for royal child. While mainstream scholars interpret these additions as artistic flourishes or symbolic references to classical learning, conspiracy-minded researchers argue they may represent encoded migration routes of Cleopatra's hidden descendants. It may sound fantastical, yet cartographers of the period often used coded symbols to communicate restricted navigational knowledge. If a secret patron wanted certain information hidden yet preserved, maps would have been an ideal medium. The final layer of symbolic encryption emerges in early modern esoteric societies, particularly Hermetic and Masonic circles. Some ritual diagrams from these groups depict a crowned woman holding an ankh, surrounded by 7 stars representing a hidden royal line. The crowned woman bears no official explanation in the society's surviving documents, but her symbolism echoes through Masonic tracing boards, alchemical sigils, and Rosicrucian emblems. The ankh, unmistakably Egyptian, ties her to a legacy far older than the European frameworks surrounding the societies. Did these symbols originate from a rediscovered Egyptian secret, a Renaissance fascination with antiquity, or a deliberate preservation of Cleopatra's bloodline myth? We may never know with certainty. Yet the cumulative evidence, fragmentary, disputed, symbolic, suggests a persistent tradition intent on encoding a secret lineage across centuries. Even if literal survival of Cleopatra's children cannot be conclusively proven, the symbolic survival of her bloodline is undeniable. Her story, her image, her legacy wove themselves into esoteric metaphors that traveled further than any documented genealogy ever could. Through mystical texts, occult allegories, sacred statues, coded maps, and ritual diagrams, Cleopatra's lineage, real or mythic, transformed into a powerful, enduring symbol. Whether it represented political truth, mythological memory, or esoteric metaphor, it survived in the one place Rome could never conquer. The imaginations of those who believe history's greatest secrets must be protected beneath layers of symbols. As the centuries passed and the ancient world dissolved into medieval kingdoms and early modern empires, the question of Cleopatra's hidden bloodline did not disappear. It merely shifted into new arenas. What was once encoded in mythic symbols, secret manuscripts, and ritual allegories gradually began resurfacing in the modern age, but filtered through the lens of archaeology, anthropology, genetics, and fringe historical research. With each new discovery, the established narrative wavered slightly, as though the past itself were trying to whisper a truth long buried beneath sand, censorship, and empire. This stage of investigation, rooted in contemporary evidence, feels less like the dreamy haze of ancient mysteries and more like the tightening focus of a lens pulling an obscured figure into view. It is here, in the realm of modern research, that the possibility of Cleopatra's surviving lineage collides with scientific curiosity and academic suspicion. The dawn of modern Egyptology in the 19th century marked the first significant shift. When hieroglyphs were deciphered by Champollion, scholars expected to find definitive records about Cleopatra's dynasty, records that would either confirm or dismiss the idea of a surviving Ptolemaic bloodline. Yet the opposite occurred. Instead of clarity, researchers found conspicuous absences. The eras immediately following Cleopatra's reign, especially under Roman control, contained gaps, missing records, and erased names. Some chalked this up to typical archival decay, but others argued the erasure looked far too targeted. The Romans, after all, had mastered the political art of damnatio memoriae. If Cleopatra's heir survived, or if Roman authorities feared that a surviving heir might inspire rebellion, their names and stories would have been among the first to be erased. Ironically, the silence itself became evidence, a void that spoke louder than inscriptions ever could. Another shift came in the early 20th century when excavation teams uncovered burial sites in regions tied to the possible migration of Cleopatra's surviving family, areas in Crete, Cyprus, and parts of North Africa. While mainstream archaeology linked these burials to local elites, independent researchers noticed anomalies: Greek-Egyptian hybrid grave goods, iconography of Isis subtly woven into funerary murals, and skull morphologies that did not neatly fit local populations. None of these findings proved anything directly, but each discovery added layers to an already persistent question. If Cleopatra's lineage faded completely, why do traces of Ptolemaic-style burial practices appear centuries later in unexpected locations? The development of genetic science in the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought even more intrigue. The controversial mummies suspected to be members of Cleopatra's family, most notably the individuals found in the Taposiris Magna Temple site, sparked global debates. When some early DNA testing suggested that one of the female mummies might have had connections to the Near East or North Africa, it reignited public imagination. Critics argued the data was inconclusive, too degraded to draw meaningful conclusions, while alternative historians pointed to the results as the first scientific confirmation that Cleopatra's ancestry was far more complex and perhaps more widely dispersed than traditional narrative suggested. A world hungry for mystery latched onto the possibility that a royal Egyptian bloodline with Greek and Near Eastern roots may have continued quietly through unsuspecting descendants scattered across the Mediterranean. One of the most compelling strands of modern research comes from linguistic anthropology. Scholars studying the migration patterns of certain Mediterranean families discovered oral traditions containing stories that eerily resemble Ptolemaic-era events. In remote villages of Tunisia, Greece, and rural Turkey, families speak of ancient queens, fleeing children, and a lineage that must remain hidden from northern conquerors. These stories, often dismissed as folklore, share uncanny similarities with each other, even when separated by hundreds of miles and linguistic differences. Some speak of a serpent mother whose identity had to remain secret. Others reference a golden child, a term reminiscent of the sun's symbolism associated with Ptolemaic heirs. Whether these traditions stem from shared ancient myth or from the whispered memories of real descendants is a controversy still debated. Then came the 21st century wave of fringe, but surprisingly meticulous independent researchers. Genealogists tracing aristocratic European lineages noticed anomalies. Unexplained origins attached to noble families in Sicily, Provence, and the Levant. Some records indicated ancestors who arrived suddenly, bearing Greek-sounding names but practicing Egyptian-influenced customs. Others showed matrilineal lines that seemed oddly protected, as though the families themselves believed the maternal lineage carried exceptional significance. This maternal focus mirrors Cleopatra's own strategies, for she understood that Rome could erase the father's name, but not the mother's blood. Even though mainstream historians reject the idea that any European dynasty could directly descend from Cleopatra, the genealogical irregularities continue to inspire speculation. Modern secret societies and esoteric groups also contribute their own peculiar pieces to the puzzle. While often shrouded in myth and exaggeration, some of their archives contain references to a living star line or a line of the rose serpent, phrases that alternative historians interpret as symbolic titles for Cleopatra's supposed surviving bloodline. Though impossible to confirm, these references show that the idea of the lineage did not vanish. It evolved, taking root in cultures obsessed with ancient wisdom and forbidden histories. Whether they hold real historical records or merely symbolic traditions is uncertain, but the persistence of Cleopatra-related symbolism in modern occult groups mirrors the symbolic transmissions uncovered in earlier centuries. Even digital age research has contributed to the mystery. Online databases of ancient DNA, once accessible only to professionals, now allow citizen scientists to analyze population migrations. Some enthusiasts have claimed to detect unusual genealogical signatures, blends of Macedonian Greek, Levantine, and Egyptian ancestry, in families from regions historically linked to Cleopatra's possible escape routes. While professional geneticists caution against overinterpretation, the fact remains that such hybrid patterns do exist, scattered across southern Europe and North Africa. Are they evidence of Cleopatra's descendants, or simply the result of centuries of Mediterranean mixing? It is nearly impossible to say, but the allure of the question continues to fuel research. The search for Cleopatra's tomb adds yet another dimension to modern investigations. If her burial site is ever discovered intact, it could finally answer the question of her surviving heirs. Some archaeologists believe her tomb was deliberately concealed to protect the identity of those she hoped to save. If any inscription or funerary text references a child hidden from Rome, the implications would be enormous. This possibility has led to increased funding, renewed excavations, and global interest in sites such as Taposiris Magna. Each uncovered artifact, each subterranean chamber, and each unexplained symbol is scrutinized not just for historical value, but for any whisper of a hidden lineage. Ultimately, modern evidence does not confirm Cleopatra's surviving bloodline, but neither does it conclusively deny it. Instead, it creates a landscape of tantalizing hints, suggestive gaps, and peculiar coincidences. The scientific age, instead of resolving the mystery, has deepened it. Every new discovery, whether archaeological, genetic, or anthropological, adds another thread to a tapestry already too complex to dismiss as mere legend. It is as though the modern world, armed with tools the ancients could never imagine, is slowly brushing sand away from an old, deliberate silence. And through this unfolding investigation, one truth becomes undeniable. Cleopatra's legacy did not die with her. Whether her bloodline survived in flesh or in symbol, history itself seems determined to keep the possibility alive. The closer researchers come, the more the ancient queen's presence seems to rise from the shadows, challenging us to consider that the greatest secrets of antiquity may still lie just beyond the reach of certainty, waiting for the moment they choose to reveal themselves. History reaches a strange tension point when speculation begins to intersect with possibility, and possibility begins to blur with revelation. In this penultimate turn of the narrative, the investigation leaves the realm of scattered clues and enters the domain of high-stakes synthesis. Here, the question is no longer merely whether Cleopatra's bloodline survived, but what it would mean if it did, and what the evidence suggests when viewed through a single cohesive lens. This is the stage in which the story folds in on itself, pulling every fragment from the past 14 sections into a rising crescendo. It is a crossroads where ancient secrecy collides with modern understanding, and where the shadows of Cleopatra's world converge into a single, looming silhouette. To grasp the magnitude of the reveal, we must revisit the forces that shaped Cleopatra's final days. Rome wanted total erasure of her legacy. Her family threatened their imperial narrative. Her children, especially those with Mark Antony, were not merely royal heirs. They were living crossroads between the Ptolemaic dynasty and Rome's most influential families. A surviving heir would have been an explosive political threat, capable of uniting loyalists, inspiring rebellions, and fracturing the emerging empire. Understanding this pressure illuminates why survival would have required absolute secrecy, why names would be erased, why tombs would vanish, and why lineage would dissolve into symbol rather than text. The motivations were immense, and it's precisely because the stakes were so high that the fragments of survival we have traced feel so compelling. Suppression leaves fingerprints, and in this historical silence, many see the outline of a truth carefully concealed. Now, imagine for a moment that at least one child did survive. Not in the loud, well-documented fashion of Roman heirs, but through the quiet migration patterns we traced, across islands, into hidden enclaves, down maternal lines that preserved blood rather than titles. In this hypothetical yet increasingly plausible scenario, the bloodline would have had to shed its identity like a snake sheds skin. Names would change. Histories would be reinterpreted. Worship practices would blend into local customs. Even physical features, diluted through generations, would scatter across the Mediterranean. What remains is not a clear genetic dynasty, but a subtle drift, a faint, persistent signature in populations that historically overlapped with Cleopatra's potential escape routes. Modern geneticists cannot point to a genome and declare it Ptolemaic, but they can acknowledge the presence of unusual lineages that raise tantalizing questions. More intriguing still is the symbolic survival. If Cleopatra understood that her children would be hunted, she may have turned to the oldest strategy in the ancient world, embedding truth into myth. We now revisit the encoded symbols from earlier sections: black Madonnas, alchemical queens, veiled goddesses, and secret society emblems, with new clarity. These motifs did not emerge randomly. They appeared in regions connected to Cleopatra's hypothetical descendants and persisted in remarkably consistent forms. What if these symbols were more than metaphors? What if they served as cultural camouflage, protecting a living lineage by transforming it into spiritual imagery? The genius of such a strategy lies in its duality. No empire can erase a legend, and no conqueror can suppress a myth that survives through ritual and faith. In this light, the persistence of Isis-like imagery in medieval Europe becomes less an artistic coincidence and more a quiet echo a whisper of something that once walked in flesh. The archaeological record adds yet another layer. Though we lack a confirmed tomb, we have found enough anomalies, hybrid burials, foreign grave goods, unexpected inscriptions, to suggest a movement of people with elite traditions traveling through lands where Cleopatra's family might have fled. In some cases, funerary symbols appear deliberately altered, as if the artisans attempted to hide identities without fully erasing meaning. Names are abbreviated or replaced. Titles disappear, but motifs remain. These are the hallmarks of families protecting something precious, heritage without danger. If the Romans eradicated written records, the people themselves adapted, carrying their identity silently through objects, customs, and oral lore. Then there is the political dimension. Throughout medieval and early Renaissance history, sudden appearances of influential families with mysterious origins have puzzled historians. These families, arriving with wealth, knowledge, or unusual connections, often intermarried with local aristocracy, stabilizing their places. Some carried symbols resembling Alexandrian iconography. Others maintained genealogical traditions that avoided explicit mention of origins, as though their ancestors carried a memory too dangerous to speak aloud. In certain cases, their migration routes align eerily with regions where Cleopatra's allies once held influence. When these accumulations are plotted together, a shadow pattern begins to emerge, not proof, but a compelling geometry of absence and presence. Yet the climax of this analysis rests not in artifacts or symbols or genealogies, but in the broader idea of historical survival. Power structures suppress what threatens them. Narratives erase what contradicts them. For Rome, erasing Cleopatra's bloodline meant reasserting dominance. For later empires, rewriting her story meant reinforcing their own legitimacy. And for centuries, the image of Cleopatra passed through filters: Roman, Byzantine, medieval Christian, Victorian, modern cinematic. Each era reshaped her, carving away inconvenient truths and amplifying convenient myths. But beneath every retelling, there is a persistent undertone, fascination bordering on obsession. This cultural fixation may not be accidental. People throughout history have been drawn to Cleopatra not only because she was powerful, intelligent, and defiant, but because her story feels unfinished. And that is the essence of this section's reveal. The possibility that the story is unfinished. That the silence, gaps, and symbolic transmissions do not point to a clean ending, but to a carefully veiled continuation. Cleopatra's bloodline, if it survived, would now be so thoroughly blended into modern populations that identifying a single descendant would be nearly impossible. The lineage would be diffuse, integrated, untraceable in traditional genealogical terms. Yet the idea of her lineage, alive, hidden, encoded, remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. And this idea continues to shape research, inspire excavations, and fuel speculation because it resonates at a deep human level. It is a reminder that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is whispered by those who escaped. In this moment, standing at the threshold between evidence and interpretation, the narrative arrives at its most gripping point. The centuries-long pursuit of Cleopatra's hidden heritage gathers into a single, breathtaking possibility: that the queen whose life defied empires may have achieved her greatest victory in secrecy, protecting her legacy not through monumental inscriptions, but through the quiet survival of blood disguised across continents. The suspense remains. The answers are close, but not yet complete. The ultimate revelation lies just ahead, waiting in the final section, where everything converges and the story reaches the point that historians, dreamers, and seekers have pursued for generations. As the long journey through Cleopatra's hidden legacy reaches its final breath, the atmosphere shifts into something quiet, profound, and strangely intimate. The centuries of silence, fragments of symbols, scattered hints, and enigmatic traditions we have followed now gather like drifting sands around a single, timeless question. What does it truly mean if Cleopatra's bloodline survived? And perhaps more importantly, what does it mean that this possibility continues to captivate the human imagination, generation after generation? In the face of overwhelming imperial power, Cleopatra crafted her legacy with an artistry that transcended politics. She knew Rome could erase inscriptions, destroy monuments, and rewrite narratives. But she also understood a truth older than empires. Ideas cannot be conquered, symbols cannot be silenced, and bloodlines, once set in motion, can disappear into history's shadows, yet survive in ways no empire can anticipate. This awareness reframes the entire mystery. Perhaps Cleopatra was not fighting merely for a throne or a dynasty, but for the right of her descendants, real or symbolic, to outlive the empire that sought to erase her. And if we entertain the possibility that her lineage continued, hidden across continents and generations, then the story becomes far more than the search for a missing heir. It becomes the testament of a woman who refused to let the forces of her time define the fate of her family. Whether carried in the genes of unknown descendants, preserved in coded rituals, or immortalized through symbols adopted by secret societies and mystical traditions, Cleopatra's legacy survived because the world refused to forget her. Every century rediscovered her in its own way, sometimes as a seductress, sometimes as a scholar, sometimes as a victim, sometimes as a queen. Yet beneath every portrayal lies the same pulsing mystery. Who was she really, and what did she leave behind? In the end, the evidence forms a constellation rather than a single line. No one artifact proves survival. No one genealogy closes the case. No single discovery reveals a living descendant with unmistakable Ptolemaic blood. Yet when the pieces are placed side by side, the symbolic transmissions, the esoteric traditions, the migration anomalies, the buried artifacts, the erased names, the unexplained oral histories, they point to something deliberate, something intentional, something carefully hidden. They form a pattern too consistent to ignore, as though history itself conspired to leave enough clues to spark curiosity, but not enough to offer certainty. And perhaps that is the point. Some mysteries survive because they are meant to. Some stories refuse conclusion because they continue to shape the world long after the people who live them have turned to dust. Cleopatra's life was one of duality, scholar and seductress, politician and philosopher, queen and exile, beloved ruler and hunted enemy of empire. Her death was dramatic, but her legacy was subtle, woven into myth, encrypted in symbol, buried in rumor, scattered through bloodlines that may have persisted long after Rome's glory faded into ruin. As we look at our modern world, fragmented yet interconnected, scientific yet spiritually hungry, it becomes clear why Cleopatra's hidden bloodline continues to fascinate. She represents resilience against overwhelming force. She symbolizes the survival of identity when history tries to eradicate it. She is a reminder that truth is often stranger than fiction, and that humanity has always been drawn to the idea of lost heirs, forgotten dynasties, and royal lines that flow invisibly through time. Even if no living descendant ever steps forward, even if science never isolates a Cleopatra gene, the influence of her story is undeniable. Her possible lineage has shaped legends, inspired movements, given birth to secret traditions, and carved itself into the imagination of people across cultures. In that sense, the bloodline has already survived through the endurance of belief itself. Not biological survival, perhaps, but mythological survival. And myth, in many ways, is more powerful. It outlasts stone. It outlives kingdoms. In the closing breath of this journey, we find ourselves not with a neat answer, but with a deeper question. What if the real legacy of Cleopatra's bloodline is not found in DNA markers or historical records, but in the persistent human yearning to reconnect with forgotten histories? What if her descendants, whether literal or symbolic, exist within every generation that refuses to allow her story to be defined solely by the empire that tried to erase her? In that view, Cleopatra's greatest triumph was not political but timeless. She became a legend whose influence has survived beyond the reach of emperors, conquerors, and even historians. And so we stand here at the quiet edge of centuries of speculation, understanding that the trail does not end. It simply continues beyond the visible horizon. Somewhere, perhaps in a dusty archive not yet opened, beneath an unexcavated chamber, within a half-translated manuscript, or even carried unknowingly in the blood of ordinary people living today, pieces of Cleopatra's hidden lineage may still rest, waiting for the moment when history is ready to see them. But until that revelation arrives, if it ever does, the greatest truth we have uncovered is that Cleopatra did not vanish. Not fully. Not in the way her enemies intended. Her story persists. Her mysteries endure. Her presence lingers between the lines of ancient texts, beneath the symbols carved by medieval artisans, within the coded rituals of esoteric traditions, and across the vast web of modern speculation. She lives on in the shadows of history, in the fragments of forgotten lore, and in the collective imagination of every generation that refuses to let her be reduced to propaganda. In this way, her bloodline, whether literal or metaphorical, remains alive. And as we close our eyes at the end of this long, winding journey, one thought whispers through the centuries like a breeze through ancient stone. Some secrets are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered. Cleopatra's legacy is one of them.